The end of the Middle Ages. The English literary scene after the death of Chaucer is not inspiring. The 15th century, though it saw a significant increase in lay literacy and marked an important stage in the rise of the middle class, suffered from the confusions and demoralization of the long reign of Henry VI and of the Wars of the Roses which followed it. Significant new forces were indeed working in the national culture. The victory of English over French was now clear and complete. A new class of readers was slowly developing. The new movement of humanism was beginning to awaken English interest, and social and economic changes were bringing about the transformation of the feudal system into a freer society based on a money economy. But it was some time before these changes were reflected in any important new movement of the mind or the spirit. At the beginning of the 15th century, it was clear that none of Chaucer's followers had his technical brilliance, his imagination, or his understanding of men. And there was none who could combine the courtly and the bourgeois tradition as Chaucer had done. 15th century courtly poetry sometimes uses the old modes with a certain freshness. The Flower and the Leaf, long wrongly attributed to Chaucer, uses traditional material with charm, giving a new twist to the handling of tapestry figures of allegorical significance by having the narrator a woman and by having the two opposing sets of characters, worshippers of the flower and of the leaf. The idle and the faithful treat each other with gentle friendliness, and other works of the Chaucer Apocrypha have their own appeal, though none is as fresh as the flower and the leaf. The Cuckoo and the Nightingale is a debate using familiar properties. La Belle Dame sans Emerchi, which gave Keats a title, has a lover pleading in vain with a lady whose matter-o-fact indifference to his love almost breaks out of the whole courtly love tradition. The Assembly of Ladies tells in heavy allegorical detail of pleadings before the lady loyalty. We see here a tradition working itself out. Thomas Hoccleve and John Lydgate are the best known of Chaucer's followers in England. Their lives overlapped Chaucer's, and Hoccleve apparently knew the master personally. Yet they seem to belong to a different age. Hoccleve wrote less than Lydgate, but he is the more interesting, for though there is little to choose between the two on grounds of poetic merit, or LCK of it, there are realistic and autobiographical touches in Hoccleve's work that help to enliven it for us. He was a minor civil servant, a connoisseur of London nightlife and a tavern hunter, perpetually in need of money, seeking noble patrons and writing them begging verse letters. His Mail Régie tells the story of his misspent life and ends with an appeal to the Lord Treasurer to pay him his overdue pension. There are some fairly vivid touches. How was a greater Easter eke than why a bet acquainted at Westminster yet among the taverners namely and coaxes? When I cam, early or late, I pinched nat at him in min arcade. The believer for I was the welcomer algate and for a very gentle man he holder. And there is the well-known line, excess at board hath laid his KNYF with me. Especially, purchasing his longer works are mechanical and tedious. They include many translations, among them the Regiment of Princes, compiled from a variety of sources. His religious and didactic works have little value as literature, though they seem to re-erect a genuine piety, for all his love of taverns. Technically, his verse is extraordinarily unaccomplished. He is content if he produces the requisite number of syllables in the line, paying no attention to how they are stressed, while Lydgate, on the other hand, is happy if he has the requisite number of stresses and does not seem to care how many or what kind of unstressed syllables he has. He had a genuine admiration for Chaucer, and introduced into the Regiment of Princes stanzas in praise of him. O Maester dear and fudde reverend, my Maester Chaucer floor of eloquence, mirror of fructuous endowment. O universe I fader in science. Elsewhere he hails him as the MSTE founder of Or a fair language. Chaucer, it is clear, became a legend soon after his death, but this does not mean that any of his English admirers had the ability to follow in his footsteps. Lydgate is almost universally written off as a bore, and though he has occasional felicitous touches, there is little reason to disagree with this verdict. Unlike Hoccleve, Lydgate led a cloistered life as a monk, mostly at Bury 5T. Edmonds, and though this did not prevent him from managing to see a good deal of men and affairs, and certainly did not prevent him from reading widely. For the library at the Benedictine Abbey at Bury, yes, one of the best St. Tilda CKED in England, they had nothing of Chaucer's gift of turning Bath his reading and his experience to lively account in his own writing. Over 145,000 lines of his verse survive, including the mammoth Fall of Princes, from a French prose version of Boccaccio's De Cassibus Illustrium Virorum. The almost equally lengthy Troy book, from Judo dell'Iolon's Historia Troiana, several lives of saints, done for different patrons, several translations from the French, and many miscellaneous shorter poems, both secular and religious in subject. There is a deadening lameness in his versification, together with a syntactical looseness, which makes the reading of his longer didactic works a severe penance. Lydgate's were the routine didactic interests of the unadventurous spirits of his time, and we can at least console ourselves with the thought that his work illustrates the early 15th century English mind. He contributed something, too, both to the themes of English literature and to the vocabulary of English. His Fall of Princes is the first full-dress collection of tragedies, in the medieval sense of stories of falls from high to low estate, of the many that were to influence English thought and literature up to Shakespeare's Richard II. His Danse Macabre introduced to England, from the French, a theme of great significance in medieval thought and art of the period. Death the Leveller, who addresses in turn all classes of men, Pope, Emperor, Cardinal, King, and so on down the scale to laborer, friar, child, clerk, and hermit, points the grim moral of a common mortality which is found so often stressed in the 15th century. Lydgate added many new words to the English vocabulary, though he rarely employed them with much sensitivity or poetic force. They are mostly polysyllabic words from Latin or French, such as inexcusable, credulity, tolerance, and adolescence. But what the reader is most conscious of is his frequent use of tag phrases, sothly to te, taharnis namo to say, as to min, intent, if I shall not lie, etc. Lydgate is at his best in his shorter poems, and in those where the demands of the narrative compel him to some liveliness of detail, and it might be added that his feeling for small children has been noted in his favor. A good example is his tale, The Churl and the Bird, rendered from the French. The churl has caught the bird and put it in a pretty little cage. The bird speaks, and though my cage forged were of gold in the pinnacles of beryl and crystal, I remember a proverb said of oldie who lesseth his freedom in faith he lesseth ai. For Tilda had lever upon a branch small merely to sing amenge the woods green then in a cage of silver bright and sheen. Songe and prison ha noon accordance, truest thou iwol sanji in presume? Songe procedeth of Ioa and of pleasance and prison causeth date and distraction. But even emotion seeks, in Lydgate, to express itself in didactic or proverbial form. The professions of literary incompetence made by so many of these 15th century poets represent doubtless a mere fashion, but they spoke more truly than they knew. Among the little surviving verse of Benedict Berg is a short poem of compliment to Lydgate which higgins in this common self-deprecatory vein. Nadrimid I in the moan of Panazzo, ne dranki I never at Pegasus Vella. The pale Piru saw I never also the whist I never where the muses dwell. John Walton. whose translation of Boethius into English verse shows better metrical control than most of his 15th century contemporaries, begins his prologue in similar strain. Insufficience of Kani ng and of Wyl, default of lang.ge and of eloquence. This work from Isha have withholden Ylt, the anonymous author of the Court of Sapiens. He may have been Stephen Hawes. A long allegorical, didactic poem in two parts, the first dealing with the dispute between mercy, peace, righteousness, and truth concerning the fate of man, and the second a conducted tour of medieval learning, varies the formula somewhat and speaks in livelier accents. He asks Cleo to forge my tongue to glad men auditors, professing his own deficiencies. I know myself most naked in all'art, my commune vulgare ec most interrupta, and I converse unte and born in the parties where my native language is most corrupt, and with most sundry tongues myx and rupt. The Court of Sapiens dates from about 1470. It is more vigorous in expression and competent in metrics than anything by Lydgate. But in theme it represents the uninspired development of the allegorical didactic tradition. It seems as though the simple story romance, so popular with an earlier generation of Englishmen, had been pushed out by allegory and didacticism, and, with the decay of feudalism and the slow but steady rise of a realistic and iconoclastic bourgeoisie, there was no new source of idealism to revivify the increasingly uninspired and conventional didactic allegory. But by a fruitful coincidence, the last flare-up of chivalry in the courts of Europe, a last Indian summer of knightly ideals in the earlier manner, occurred at the same time that printing came in. Caxton, who had been in Burgundy witnessing this revival at the French-speaking court of the Duke of Burgundy, brought with him, from the Low Countries, the art of printing on his return to England. The revival of interest in the chivalric story romance which accompanied chivalry's final fling was just in time to take advantage of Caxton's imported art, which accounts for the fact that some of the first works printed in England were chivalric stories of the older kind. This revival of interest in romance, though infantile, was brief. It was killed in the 16th century partly by the new movement of humanism, which in England in its early phase took a narrow view of romantic tales and, with Roger Ascham, protested against idle stories of chivalry, and partly by the growing bourgeois taste for a more realistic, picaresque kind of story. The attenuated, courtly tradition, satirical, topical, and political verse of little literary merit but of considerable historical interest, didactic, moralistic, and religious writing. These were the three main categories of 15th century English literature, and the third is the largest. The religious lyric, following the types discussed in Chapter 3, flourished during the period. Indeed, most of what has been said of the 14th century lyric applies to the 15th century also, though new themes and attitudes begin to make their appearance as the century advances, and will be discussed later. That the 15th century was a period of transition in England is obvious enough to the political and economic historian. The Wars of the Roses, where the nobility destroyed each other and the middle class rose steadily. William Caxton's introduction of print. England, Caxton's translation of Louis the Fevers Le Roi des Histoires de Troyes, printed by him as Real of the Histories of Troy at Bruges in 1474, was the first printed book published in English, and his return to London in 1475 was followed by his printing in 1477 of Daiches and Sayings of the Philosophers, the first book printed in England. The gradual impact on English thought of the humanism of the Renaissance, the establishment of the Tudor monarchy in 1485, these are obvious and significant marks of change. In the literature of the period, however, we see for the most part simply the progressive exhaustion of earlier medieval modes. Yet much that appears at first sight merely to exhibit this exhaustion can be seen on a closer view to be influenced in some degree by new ways of thinking. Stephen Hawes' allegorical romance, the pastime of pleasure, dedicated to Henry VII in 1506, continues the lame versification and the mechanical allegorizing of Lydgate. With even less notion of the true nature of allegory than his immediate predecessors, the light of rueth, I lack any ng to cloak, to draw a curtain, I dare not to presume nor hide my matter. With a misty smoke my rudines cany ng, clothes so consume yet as I may, I shall blow out a fume, to hide my mind, underneath a fable by covert colour, well and probable. It is a curious view indeed that the function of allegory is to obscure truth. Yet this smoky, didactic allegorical romance, telling, in first-person narrative, of the pursuit and eventual attainment by the hero, Grand Amour, of La Belle Pucelle shows some interesting new features. The hero, encouraged by fame, a lady, and accompanied by governance and grace, 2 greyhounds, receives an elaborate education in the Tower of Doctrine before engaging on the knightly adventures which culminate in his marriage to La Belle Pucelle. Here we have the union of the active life and the contemplative life, which had hitherto been sharply distinguished in medieval thought, following St. Augustine's influential statement in The City of God that the study of wisdom is either concerning action or contemplation, and thence assumes 2 several names, active and contemplative. The active consisting in the practice of morality in one's life, and the contemplative in penetrating into the abstruse causes of nature, and the nature of divinity. The knight and the clerk are united in Grand Amour, representing a new ideal of lay education. Further, the hero's love for La Belle Pucelle is chaste and Christian and leads to marriage, something quite impossible in the earlier courtly love tradition. The interest, one might say the obsession with education, is characteristic of the age. The combination of the didactic romance with the romance of knightly adventure in a context of education looks forward to Spenser's Faerie Queene. And at the end, after the hero has married and lived happily ever after, he addresses the reader from the grave in the one memorale stanza of the poem, O mortal folk, you may behold her and say how I lie here. Som theme a mighty Kun, the ender of joy and all prosperite as Daiches at LASL through his course and my MTER the day there cometh the dirk NYGHT. For though the day be never so lunge at last the bells ringeth to even song. The 7 deadly sins, and fame, time, and eternity, all play their part in the final pageant, which shows a certain grandeur of conception in spite of the technical inadequacy of the verse. How dismal to the point of being positively corny the verse can become is illustrated by the following passage, describing the hero's education in grammar at the hands of Derne Doctrine. To whom she answered, Write gently again, sighing alway, that a noun substantive might stand a without help of an adjective. The Latin word, which that is referred unto a thing, which is substantial for a noun substantive as well a word, and with a gender is declinal. So all the I parties in general are Latin words, annexed proprial to every speech. For to speak formally, this intolerable doggerel is representative of a whole area of late medieval English didactic verse. Yet not only does the pastime of pleasure have its moments of perception and even of eloquence, it is also a work of considerable historical importance in that it illustrates an attitude toward love, education, and the relation of the active to the contemplative life which foreshadows both the courtesy books of the Renaissance and the use of romance made by Spenser. Hawes saw himself, however, as a follower rather than as a pioneer and he mentions Gower, Chaucer, and Lydgate, in that order, as his masters, listing the major works of the latter two. He seems utterly elevare of Chaucer's superiority to the other two, and Lydgate is especially praised for his eloquence. O Master Lydgate, the most dulcet spring of famous rhetoric, with ballad royal, the shepherd original of my Lemiog, what waileth it, on your for to call me for to ide? No way in especial. Sithen your body is now wrapped in chest. I pray God to give your soul good rest. Haw's other allegorical didactic romance, the example at virtue, is shorter and less interesting. And few other late medieval exercises in this mode have any special appeal. William Neville's Castell, F. Pleasure, 1518, is worth mentioning only because its printer, Robert Copeland, himself, like Caxton, a translator and dabbler in letters, introduces a dialogue between the printer and the author at the beginning of the poem, and because, in its mechanical use of the allegorical formulas, it sinks to probably record depths of dullness. No underscore where is the popular medieval obeisant theme handled so happily, where is Tully, which he had principalite over all orators in parfait rhetoric? Where be all the four doctors of Divioid? Where is Aristotle for all his philosophy and logic? Alexander Barclay, ca. 1475 to 1552, is a transitional figure of soil A importance. His Ship of Fools, 1509, provided a new metaphor for English satire. It is a rendering of the NRNGFJ of the German Sebastian Brand through the Latin translation of Locker, a sweet s. Flew Barclay's own comments expand tile poem to many T-lines TL, a length of his original. Satire, of course, was not unknown in the year_lyre Middle Ages. The Fablio tradition, as we have seen, is largely satirical, and Jean de Meun, Chaucer, and Langland have each his own satirical vein. The conception of the important people of a world as a collection of fools, courtiers, ecclesiastics, scholars, AIT merchants alike seems to have become popular in the later Middle Ages. And Brandt's idea of putting them all in a boat sailing off to Narragansett gave a new liveliness to the whole conception. It is a development of the older handling of the seven deadly sins. And the shift of attention from moral evil to intellectual folly is significant of a new temper in European civilization. The Ship of Fools looks for_what to Erasmus' praise of folly as much as it looks backward to tile theme of the seven deadly sins. Its interest is more in the contempo_rare social scene than with moral types, and this again marks an IIB potent development. Barclay's rhyme royal stanzas are pedestrian enough in movement, but the self-characterization of the representer_types of different kinds of folly provides some vivid glimpses of the society of the time. Satire, so long directed against ecclesiastical abuses, is beginning to come to wider themes, including life at court, increasingly important with the establishment of the new national state with its centralized monarchy and intellectual fashions. The satiric stream widens and deepens after Barclay, with Skelton's Bourge of Court and Speak, Parrot concentrating on the contemporary scene. The changes which Renaissance court life and the first effects of Renaissance humanism brought with them stimulated conservative minds to angry satire. And while the attack on folly is itself a humanist theme, attacks on humanism as well as on other novelties are made by angry conservatives. Indeed, angry conservatives have always produced the greatest satire, from Aristophanes to Swift. And while neither Barclay nor Skelton can be regarded as a great satirist, they do share the great satirist's sense of outrage at what contemporary man is making of himself. The pastoral also becomes at this time a vehicle for satire in English. It comes to replace the dream as the commonest kind of machinery for satirical as well as many other purposes. Barclay produced 5 eclogues, 3 translated, with many expansions, from the Miserere of Pope Pius II, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, and two from the late 15th and early 16th century Italian poet Baptista Mantuanus, known as Mantung in England, where he was much admired for his Latin pastorals in the 16th and 17th centuries. Thus a new breath from classical literature comes, though indirectly, into English literature, the first of very many such. The use of the pastoral for satire of court life, urban life, ecclesiastical corruption, and other abuses of the time, as well as to discuss literary questions, established itself early in the Renaissance. Berkeley is the first English writer to use a device, already common in Italy, which was to be developed significantly by succeeding generations of English poets, notably by Spenser in his Shepherd's Calendar. And as the Shepherd's Calendar, as we shall see, is in some sense both the manifesto and the first fruits of the New English poetry, the pastoral tradition is clearly of prime importance in English literature. We shall have to look at it more closely later.